I'm Jace Lacob, and you're listening to Masterpiece Studio. Miss Austen begins on a grey day, like any other in the 19th century English countryside. Cassandra Austen gets dressed and begins her morning chores. Cassandra's life is one of routine in her little garden and around her little village, particularly after the death of her sister, the celebrated author Jane Austen, for whom Cassandra served as best friend, caretaker, and confidant. But as she's feeding the hungry goats, this seemingly typical day takes an unexpected turn.
A letter for you, Miss Austen. Oh, from Kintbury. Kintbury?
My dear Cassandra, I am writing to inform you that my father, Fuller, has only a short time left with us.
It's the Reverend Fowle. He's dying.
The letter was sent by Isabella Fowle, daughter of the Reverend Fuller Fowle. The Austens and the Fowles have been intertwined for decades, as Fuller Fowle was married to Jane and Cassandra Austen's cousin, Eliza. Isabella writes that her father is close to death, news which strikes a devastating blow to Cassandra. Despite Isabella's urging Cassandra to stay put, she packs her bags and heads to Kintbury to see the Reverend one last time.
No, you must do something for me. You promised me.
What?
Isabella. You must live with her sisters. You promised me.
Don't worry not. There is no greater comfort in this world than a sister.
The next morning, news of the Reverend's passing casts a dark shadow over the vicarage. Not only has Isabella lost a father, but she must now vacate her home, as the new vicar, Mr. Dundas, is looking to move in straight away. Meanwhile, Isabella's aunt, Mary Austen, who is Eliza's sister, decides her son should write a biography of the Austen family. And to do so, he'll need the letters that Jane and Eliza wrote to each other.
I must instruct Isabella not to remove any of my sister's private correspondence. I will take care of that. There's sure to be letters in Eliza's room that will cast up all manner of treasure. After all, Jane and Eliza corresponded vigorously. As did you and Eliza, if I recall.
Surely you do not intend to do this now, my dear. And after all, the day has been trying enough.
But for Cassandra, it would be a disaster to Jane's literary and personal legacy if these letters were to make their way into Mary's hands.
Dinah says you've made a start on clearing my dear sister's room.
You know I wish to help.
Did you find any letters from Jane?
Not a single one.
How odd, considering how often Jane wrote.
Author Gill Hornby joins us today to discuss how she crafted the rich and mysterious world of her novel, Miss Austen, and the redemption of Cassandra Austen. This week, we are joined by Miss Austen author Gill Hornby. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So before we delve into Miss Austen, I'm curious about your personal relationship with Jane Austen before writing the story of Jane Austen and Miss Austen. What was your first experience reading Jane Austen's work?
Well, my first experience was at school, and I was 16. I'd been a pretty terrible student until that moment. And then I had one of those English teachers that come along and change your life. And she came along and changed my life, and she did it via Jane Austen. We're having to do Mansfield Park. But she singled me out to read all the rest of the Austens and to stay behind after school and discuss them with her. She civilized me, really, through the works of Jane Austen. I think it was her sort of channel into this wayward child and turned me into something that I hadn't been before. But I didn't engage with the life at all. I mean, I obviously adored the novels, but I didn't engage with the life at all until I was in my 30s. And we moved to this house in the village of Kintbury, and I was told that there was a Jane Austen connection. And the connection actually turned out to be her sister Cassandra, who had been engaged to the son of the house, the vicarage in which we were living. And that engagement had ended in tragedy. And she began to haunt me. Cassandra, not Jane, actually, began to haunt me because I've always been fascinated by those women in the 18th and 19th centuries. Their futures were marriage and children and a home. And then they had that ripped away from them. And how did they invent the rest of their lives? You know, how did they improvise having a life after that with any kind of security? Because this was before, in Britain, the Married Women's Act. And so women had no right to their own money at all. So I began to think of her. I knew that she had been staying in our house and her first Christmas away from the Austens. It was the first time her sister Jane had written to her, because it was the first time they'd ever been apart. And then she had to kiss goodbye to her fiancé at the gate before dawn one January morning, and then never saw him again. And so she really haunted me. I mean, whenever I sort of walked through the gate, I thought of her. I was purely by chance then commissioned to write a biography of Jane Austen for children, for 8 to 12-year-olds. So I first read the biographies and was astonished to find that none of the biographers liked Cassandra. She was terribly unpopular because she destroyed so much evidence of Jane's life after Jane's death. Then I read the memoirs of the nieces and nephews of the two. They're all about how Jane was a sparkling genius creature and Cassandra was just a dry old stick. So I was sort of a bit affronted. Then I read Jane's letters that we do have, which are mostly to Cassandra, and saw a completely different side to it. I saw that Jane adored her. Not just adored her, was dependent on her. She wouldn't trim a bonnet without asking Cassandra's opinion. And then towards the end of her life, when Jane became mysteriously ill, she became very emotionally dependent on Cassandra. There's one thing where Cassandra's been called away to look after some other hypochondriac relative when she'd much rather be looking after Jane. And Jane writes to soothe her, saying, please don't worry about me. I was ill at the time of your going purely from the fact of your going. And I thought that was so moving. And then Jane died in her arms. And so I thought, if Jane adored her, then I can carry on adoring her. And also I began that sort of furious about the way she'd been treated by everybody else. And so it brewed in my head that I really wanted to make the case for her. We know so little about either of them, really, that it seemed to me the only way it could be done was in fiction. It took me a while to get up the nerve to do it. But really, it's a kind of propaganda work on the case for Cassandra Austen and why actually she's great and we all ought to be on our knees with gratitude because she did so much for Jane.
As you mentioned earlier, you live in Kintbury in a former vicarage on the site of the house where Tom Fowle, Cassandra Austen's fiance, once lived. And you walk through Austen family history essentially every day, looking at the same garden and views that Jane and Cassandra would have.
Yeah.
How did that help to inspire you to write Miss Austen?
Oh, it was marvellous. I mean, there's quite a lot of research to be done when you're writing historical novels, obviously. And it's not my favourite bit of the whole process. And what was so great about Miss Austen was basically I was setting 75% of the novel in my own backyard. So whenever I was kind of slightly stuck for inspiration, I had to look out of the window. That was very relaxing. But it did add a certain something as well because I could recreate the village and the way it slotted in the facts of village life, which were quite easy to trace. In the series, there's a daughter called Isabella who is unmarried and her father's just died and she's being turfed out of her house. Very much like Jane, has nowhere to go, you know, looking at hideous insecurity. But unlike Jane, does have a quiet secret love that her father had always forbidden. And all of those people are buried in the churchyard. Really, all of the characters that are in the TV series, they're all there, and I walk past them every day. I do often think about what their reaction would be to what's been going on, because it's been very, very widely viewed and to my great gratification enjoyed.
The letters within Miss Austen are entirely imagined, as Cassandra burned the majority of the confidential letters that she found. About 160 of Jane's letters, most to Cassie, survived. How did those letters help you to recreate Jane's voice in these fictionalized letters, a voice that's far more casual than her other writing?
Yes, well, it helped me create her voice generally, actually, because I sat down with this lofty ambition of defending Cassandra. I'd never written a historical novel before. I'd written 2 contemporary social comedy thingies, but I hadn't had the courage to get going on this. I wanted to do this one next. I didn't have any other idea, and my publisher said, no, thank you. So I thought, well, I'm just going to get on with it on my own because I've just got to get it out of my system. And I sat down to write it, and there was Cassandra trotting about the place. And then, of course, it suddenly occurred to me that Jane had to do exactly the same, and I couldn't put off her entry. And I kept putting it off and kept putting it off. And then I'd write, so then she'd have to turn up, and I'd write something, die of embarrassment, scratch it out, walk the dog. And then I went back to the letters, and they were such a release because the first one that she writes, to Kintbury actually, I paraphrase, she writes, I think I'm beginning to get the hang of this letter writing business. You just write to the person as if they're sitting in the armchair opposite you. And then she just prattles on about what's been happening in the neighborhood. And I thought, bingo, if that's how you say you would talk to her if she was in the armchair, then I will take your word for it. And so from that, I could just parrot that very idiosyncratic style. And I wasn't planning to have that many letters. I thought I'd have about 3 and that they would be agony. Actually, I found them very easy, so I knocked off rather a few. The other liberating thing was I thought, oh, for heaven's sake, nobody will ever read this. I'll show this to my husband or my agent. They'll say, well, that's very mortifying. And it would just be sort of put in a drawer. And I didn't show it to anyone as I was writing it. So I just thought, I'm just going to enjoy myself, do what I set out to do, and then show it to somebody or other. And that was very liberating because I think if comments had been coming in as I've been writing, if you've sold something in advance, of course, the editor has a stake, but golly, it's nice not having it and just working it out for yourself, because you go up a blind alley, but it's in reversing down the blind alley that you find your way back onto the right route. And if you've got somebody saying, you're up a blind alley, where you're going to go is there, I think you miss out a crucial part of the process. So I could evolve her over that period of time, still very unsure that it would ever find a publisher. And then when it would find a publisher, if I would be absolutely beaten up by furious Janeites, because nobody had really done it before. They'd done it in the movies, but they hadn't done it in a novel. And to my surprise, they've been unbelievably generous and welcoming about the whole thing.
You write of Jane, from the most tender age, she had a seer's talent for the analysis of character and the prediction of disasters. She was indeed something of the Cassandra of legend. It was their joke that the name should rightly be hers. How did the 2 sisters, Jane and Cassandra, balance each other?
It was sort of perfection, really. It was the perfect relationship. It's one of those relationships, like a marriage, really. Would one be the same without the other? And the whole time they were growing up, Cassandra was 3 years older. She was much better looking. She was much more organized, more capable, really intelligent. There were 6 boys and there were 2 girls. So they were immediately bonded by being the only girls in this sea of brothers. And by their difference in their circumstances, they all grew up in the same Steventon rectory. Her brothers were able to go off and be things like admirals and run a bank and become a landed gentleman. The girls had nothing, marriage or drop dead, sort of thing. And so they were each other's kind of chosen company all the way through. And also Cassandra was just a natural carer. I mean, she looked after people, and Jane was her life's work, really. Really, she was clever enough to recognize that this talent was very special and good enough to devote herself to the protection of it. And then after her death, which left Cassandra utterly grief-torn, she had 30 years without her, during which she was the keeper of the flame as Jane's kind of fame dwindled and then began to spark up again. And she was the executor of her will.
There is a beautiful thread throughout Miss Austen about lives lived and what's left behind. You write, Cassandra took another bite, and Eliza was conjured up before her. She could taste her in the fruit, see her picking and stirring and laughing and pouring, and thought, These are the things by which most of us are remembered, these small acts of love, the only evidence that we too once lived on this earth, the preserves in the larder, the stitch on the kneeler, the mark of the pen on the page. Is there power in small things when the larger ones proved fragile?
Completely. Absolutely. How many of us are going to be remembered for our work? Really, very, very, very few. We will be remembered for the love we showed to other people, for the physical evidence we leave on the earth, and for things like the parties we threw and the kindness we showed. These are the things that matter. I mean, I did think of that line when I was in our Kintbury church and looking at the kneelers that have all been tapestry on them that has been done over the last 200 years by women in the village, commemorating jubilees and armistice and this, that, and the other, you know, the death of the vicar, whatever. And I look at them and then I try and think of the women behind it. I mean, buildings, you look at them and furnishings. And yes, I think these are the traces that we leave, but also in other people's hearts, the people who survive us. Absolutely. That's probably all we can hope for.
Before this next question, a brief word from our sponsors. Ocean voyages, expeditions, river journeys. Viking is dedicated to bringing travelers closer to the destination, offering a small ship experience and a shore excursion in every port. Learn more at Viking.com. Mary Austen emerges as a villain within Miss Austen, attempting to reframe the narrative of the Austens for her own ends. Cassandra has her own reasons for wanting to protect Jane. How does the struggle between these two women power Miss Austen?
Well, quite a lot. And also, it's true. Mary Austen, she has a moment at the end of the novel where she's slightly redeemed. And the way she's portrayed in the TV series, it's done absolutely brilliantly. It kind of crumples you. The actress is just sublime. But she was very, very jealous of them both. She felt that she should be treated as another sister because she'd married their oldest brother. But she didn't have any of their attributes at all. And she became very bitter. But yeah, there were forces within the family because Jane, of course, wrote completely anonymously in her own lifetime. And her authorship was an enormous secret that she didn't share, even with nieces and nephews who were curled up on the sofa reading Pride and Prejudice. She wouldn't say, oh, I wrote that. And they'd have fallen off the sofa if they'd been told. It was a very private matter. Mary Austen's son, in his biography, writes about her just only writing for the entertainment of the family and for her own satisfaction. Rubbish. She really wanted commercial success. She knew she was good. She'd read every novel under the sun. She knew what she could rate hers as being among the highest. She wanted what she deserved. And money being in such short supply in her life, she very much wanted more of it, but also what she considered her due. After her death, one brother and nephew who took on the sort of legacy aspect just tried to create this image of this very timid little Christian creature who just was completely content in her own village and just wrote to amuse the family by the fireside, and no turbulence interrupted the smooth course of her life, which is, of course, total rubbish, but it was legacy management. So that was kind of one prong of the legacy. The other prong would have been the truth, which is what Cassandra wanted to conceal, which was the melancholia and the troubles and it's not just depression, I don't think, that she was trying to hide from the burning of the letters, but it was a certain lack of, some disobliging attitude to an awful lot of family members, particularly sisters-in-law and particularly Mary Austen, that would have very much hurt the feelings of people who lived on. So Cassandra believed that Jane's view was she wanted to be remembered for her novels. This contemporary idea we have of fame, that it's a goal in itself, that you don't have to write the great novel or be a towering president or anything to achieve fame. You just want fame, so you go on reality television and you build up fame by your own fame. You know, that sort of rather peculiar thing that's going on these days. Yeah, I cannot overestimate how Jane would have found that repulsive. Jane was all about success and reviews. She took notes of all of her reviews. They were hugely important to her. But fame was repulsive. But also she was very refined. And she was, in that way, a very sort of deep Christian, thoughtful, sensible person. And it was a thing in those days, legacy management. Cassandra, being diligent, efficient, conscientious, and intelligent, burnt the lot. Mm-hmm. And cleverly, what she did was contribute, I think, to Jane's success. And so we know little enough about her to think that she's wonderful, but not really come up with any case against her.
Cassie makes Tom a promise, swearing before God that she will never marry any man other than him. When he's killed during his expedition, it becomes a promise that she cannot break. How does the £1,000 legacy he left Cassie compound that? Is it living proof of the bargain she made in front of God?
Well, I mean, we do not know that she made a bargain in front of God. I put in the bargain in front of God, but I think it would have weighed on her. £1,000 was a hell of a lot of money. And that also was very important to Jane's future, because it meant that they were not utterly penniless, because the income from it was enough for some food for them, although it never got to that because their brothers were supportive and nice. But I think it was a slight burden because he had nieces and a mother and so on. He didn't have to give it to her, and she hadn't done a day's work as a wife, as it were. So there was no need really to recompense her. It was a godsend, an absolute godsend, because it gave her a certain sort of independence. It's a beautiful thing, that legacy, because she died quite a rich woman, weirdly, Cassandra. For a start, she was the beneficiary of Jane's will. And though the novels were kind of slowing up considerably, they did at least tick over. And also, if you lived to a certain age, she was 74, enough people have died to leave you enough money to build it up a bit. So there was that. And in her will, she remembered all the other single women, including Tom Fowle's niece, who never married and who in Kintbury was devoting her life in the way that Cassandra devoted her life to Jane, was devoting her life to the village children. And she left that whole £8,000, which is a very, potent sum in value, but also that is what Tom had left her, who then started the first Kintbury Village School with it. So it's very beautiful. I find that so moving, that that's how the money kind of traveled through time. It supported Jane and Cassandra, then it grew back again, and then it went to Tom's niece, and then it became the first schoolhouse.
They all pay it forward.
Yeah, isn't it amazing?
It's a beautiful thing. Cassandra's story is one of love and devotion to her sister. Jane's legacy is safe, her place in the literary firmament secure. These are not strange ancient animals or South Dorset fossils to be looked at with curiosity. Was this the aim behind writing Miss Austen, to treat the two sisters as fallible human beings, full of beautiful contradiction and life?
Absolutely, to just sort of bring them back, really. I think partly because I do have a very firm opinion of what Jane was like, and I wanted to present it, and I enjoyed presenting it. This very, very complicated creature, and as I say, nothing like the way she's portrayed on the £10 note or any of the rest of it. Cassandra, I had to create, really, we've got a few letters from her in much older age to a cousin that are privately published that I read. And I didn't read them till I was very late on into the novel. And I was delighted to find that I think I got her right, which is that she has that dry wit and sharpness as well, but she's much sort of cooler with it, I think. But for the rest of it, I just had to create her from being the person that Jane was writing to. Although she's remembered by her nephew as a dry, joyless old stick, So annoying. Jane at one point writes, "Oh God, I loved your account of the ball last night. I nearly died laughing, as we used to say when we were little. You really are the finest comic writer of our age." And Jane Austen wrote that to Cassandra. So she was not a person without a sense of humour. And that they did really have a laugh when they were in their happy times. I think it's very important, and to recognise what she went through, what they both went through, you know, the battle for these books. They didn't just float out of people. I mean, all writers know that it's a battle, and that, you know, just writing the thing in the first place is a sort of triumph of will. But to do it in the way that Jane did it, you know, to be just getting into her stride as a young woman and then just ripped away from it. And she had these manuscripts of these future masterpieces, and she just carried them around with her in a writing box for 8 years and didn't get them out. She just carried them around. And at one point, they were changing horses at a staging coach inn, and the writing box was put on the wrong coach. Can you imagine?
Potentially lost forever.
Yes. And it was retrieved, fortunately. But that's how precarious it was. And she didn't know in that time that it was going to come right, that she would be published, a miraculous idea, and that she would have peace of mind in which to just live and write and not have a kind of bossy husband around wanting his dinner on the table, but to just have the freedom of the day to get on with it.
After all, Jane's story and her own could not be separated, you write. They were bound tight together to form one complete history. On the fortunes of the other, each life had turned. Writing for LitHub, you said, quote, "In the story of our blessed Jane, Cassandra is the wicked one." Does Miss Austen ultimately exonerate Cassandra Austen? And do you believe that Jane Austen herself would have approved of the bonfire?
Well, I jolly well hope it exonerates her. That was all the work was for. So, yes, it blooming well does. That it really, I think, I hope I prove, I show that without Cassandra, there would be no novels, and that it is time to stop calling her wicked and just be grateful for everything that she did, that she was on our side. And she was on Jane's side in the burning of the letters. It was a deeply protective act of love to burn the letters. And I think it's quite right that she did. Of course, the irony is that I have every sympathy with their position on privacy, and I have every sympathy with Cassandra for burning the letters. And then I barge in and invent everything I think they've left out. And invade their privacy completely 100%. But there we go.
But with love. With love.
Yes, a different sort of love.
Your brother is novelist Nick Hornby. Your husband, novelist Robert Harris. You said, quote, "A male interviewer once asked me if I'd really written my novels, given who my husband and brother were. I said, why haven't you asked me if I'd written theirs?" How much do you think Jane Austen would have loved to have read that sentiment?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think we have similar experience in that. I mean, she was so overshadowed by her brothers. Completely. She had one that was rich, one that flew through Oxford and, you know, ran a literary magazine and patronized her, wrote execrable poetry and dreadful long essays, which were the fashion at the time, and was so patronizing to her about writing novels because they were a newfangled nonsense. So she knew what it's like to live under the shadow of the patriarchy. And so, yes, I think she would have enjoyed it.
There is a beautiful note of optimism embedded within Miss Austen. Happy endings are there for us somewhere, woven into the mix of life's fabric, you write. We just have to search the detail, follow the pattern to find the one that should be our own. The impetus for your first novel, The Hive, came, I believe, from being fired by the Daily Telegraph while reporting on a natural disaster in Tenerife. Did you apply that metric, searching for the pattern to find the one that should be your own in your own life and your own career as a novelist?
I think it's something I've only understood in the last few years, that actually I'm nothing without rejection. I kind of pooter along very happily, whistling in the sunshine, And then if I get some kick up the bum, like getting the sack or being rejected from a university, then I get my act together and double my efforts and knock it out of the park. But other than that, I could sort of sink into complacence with remarkable ease. So I started writing novels in my 50s. It never occurred to me to write a novel before that. For a start, everybody else in my family was at it. But also, I just hadn't written any fiction since I was 16. I was writing book reviews and columns and things like that, but I wasn't writing fiction. And I think it's really important not to stand there when you're 21 and say, I'm going to be a this. And you don't have to these days because professional life is so much more complex and we all work so much longer. You know, it's not like anybody retires at 50 anymore. And so I think it is very important with life to just sniff your way through, to find opportunities and to jump at chances. And that's something Jane and Cassandra had to do. They had to improvise. When they weren't married by the age of 25, they had to improvise how they were going to get through. And I think I've done a lot of improvisation, actually. And it's worked out all right. And, you know, as long as the Lord spares us and you have your health, life is long. And do not judge yourself on where you are when you're 30. I mean, when I was 30, I was just knee-deep in nappies and just kept having babies. And then, lo and behold, they grew up. And suddenly I have all of this energy and confidence that I never had as a younger person.
I love that. Gill Hornby, thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me.
Next time, we return to the bucolic world of Grantchester, where spring is in the air, new romances bloom, and murder is afoot.
The end is nigh. The end is nigh. It's an hijacking. That's what this is. Easter has been hijacked by the devil incarnate.
Morning, Reg. How are we?
How are we? Doomed to hellfire for all eternity. That's how we are.
No donkey ride for you then?
Be sure to tune in to the 10th season premiere of Grantchester, Sunday, June 15th at 9 p.m. Eastern on Masterpiece on PBS. Masterpiece Studio is hosted by me, Jay Slay Cobb, produced by Jack Pombriant, and edited by Robin Bissett. Alicia Etup is our sound designer. The executive producer for Masterpiece is Suzanne Simpson.